We're back at it again. I thought I got rid of you at the end of the last.
Never.
The outgoing, the outro. I was like, I thought maybe I'd pushed it over the line. Nope, guess not. I got to figure out what else to say this
You're
time.
stuck.
Oh crap! It's recording.
I figured it was.
Hey, Walt, how are you, buddy?
You're such a good technical person.
God, we have so much fun together. We are like, it's like Mutt and Jeff, Tom and Jerry. Come on, we are having a good time.
Mutt and Jeff. Gotcha.
Hey.
Thought it was lunchtime again.
Inside this room, all of my dreams become realities, and some of my realities become dreams.
What in the wide, wide world of sports is going on here? Alive! It's alive! It's alive!
You are listening to The Wilder Ride, getting wilder by the minute. Here are your hosts, Alan Sanders and Walt Murray.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Wilder Ride, where we've been getting wilder by the minute, a podcast that celebrates the films of Gene Wilder 1 minute at a time. And yes, we've already wrapped on season 2, but we told you we wanted to bring you a bonus episode. We did it at the end of season 1, had a lot of great response to that, and I thought, you know what, let's do that again. Maybe that becomes our tradition as well, Walt, to invite some folks back. You know, not everybody can come back. Everybody's got different schedules, busy schedules. So, you know, it wasn't like we intentionally left anybody off the table. It's just we grabbed a handful of voices, and we're going to have a kind of a look back at the season and sort of that finale. But I like being able to do that.
Yeah, I do too. And when you get to the end of looking at a movie like this, there are certain things that stand out to you that you never thought about before you broke it down this way. And there are things that different people have said that you really want to kind of go back and revisit. So it is a great opportunity.
So let's go ahead and introduce ourselves in case for some reason you decided to start with this episode because you've got your podcatcher set up to play the most recent podcast first. This is one of those ones you want to go back and listen to it in order.
We're not recommended.
We're not topical in the sense of like, oh, well, if after 4 weeks what you're talking about no longer applies. We're talking about movies that came out 45 years ago. So you do need to listen in order. But I'm your host. I'm Alan Sanders.
I am your co-host, Walt Murray.
And it's been fantastic to get to know so many of you out there and to introduce you to an actor and to some of the movies that we absolutely love, remember from our childhood, and continue to watch to this day. So, Walt, I guess before we even introduce our first guest as sort of a return, that's been the coolest part about this podcast is meeting new people.
Without a doubt. And there are a lot of these movie by minute podcasts out there, and I'd encourage you to go take a look at moviesbyminute.com. And I think there are 130 some odd podcasts out there.
It's probably not worth putting a number, say well over 100.
Well over 100. And Alan and I have really gotten to be friends with some of the other podcasters and podcast teams and really share an affinity for a lot of the same movies and things like that and just life in general. So to be able to have them on for 2 or 3 or 4 minutes at a time is really a lot of fun.
It has been. And we had a pretty eclectic mix. We did something different in season 2 than we did in season 1. Season 1, we thought, keep a guest the entire week. We had so many people interested in Blazing Saddles, and we wanted to try to get as much diversity in school of thought, in age range, in background, and even just where they lived in the country, that we actually kept some folks to no more than 2 minutes, some 3 minutes. The occasional person may have gotten 4, but we had a lot more guests in season 1 than we did in season 2.
I actually had a couple of people who sent me messages and said, I really want to do this because your listeners are so involved. And they were people who had joined our listeners page and they just saw how much fun y'all were having and they wanted to be a part of it. So that says a lot too.
Yeah. You know, we're meeting a lot of podcasters, but we're also meeting a lot of cool listeners too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And having great conversations in our listeners group. I love when people just randomly decide to share something. The other day, I had a friend of mine sent pictures from outside of the Burbank, from Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank, showing the exact same view today, 2019, of what it looked like in 1974 when the riot spills out into the streets of Burbank, California. I was like,
that's really crazy.
That is so cool. And remember, he'll be coming up in a minute. Remember when Professor Robert E.G. Black went and took a picture of where the theater used to be that they filmed the scenes for Young Frankenstein?
Yeah, Monster Bookstore.
And now it's the bookstore and the shoe shop.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
So we appreciate all the listeners. We appreciate getting to learn and to know a lot about people. I guess it's good we're going to have this guy go first in our look back of this season, because he is sort of like I call them the grand poobah of the Loyal Order of Water Buffalo, because he manages the Movie Maker Minute Facebook page. He's sort of like is responsible for the Movies by Minutes website. He's thought of as sort of like the granddad of the group. He didn't start it, but he's sort of like he keeps everybody on an even keel.
Right.
And that's Jim O'Kane.
Yeah, and Jim's great. He was on early with us. I think he was our first guest this season. And
he was our first official guest. Besides, outside of you and me explaining the first 3.5 minutes of credits,
right?
We brought Jim O'Kane in for minute number 4.
Yeah, and Jim's kind of the transportation expert. He knew about the railroad and all that kind of stuff. He knew about hand cars, which I had no real knowledge of. So that was
because that was a question we asked about how do hand cars know which direction they're going based on how you're pumping. How fast can you get a hand car to go? Can 2 people push a hand car?
Yeah, and he knew the answers to all that.
He's great. He was with us for minutes 4, 5, and 6. So if you're just listening to this before going back and you say, oh, I really just want to hear Jim's minutes, you can go right to minutes 4, 5, and 6. But let's hear Jim O'Kane. You'll hear him at the very beginning with his list, but he has done the airplane minute. The airport minute. Not airplane, airport minute. Rocketeer Minute, where the lead actor actually stumbled across their podcast and became a recurring guest. You have the Bond Minute that's going off and on through some of the Bond flicks. And his most recent one that he's working on is the Apollo 13 Minute. So without further ado, let's hear from Jim O'Kane.
Hi, this is Jim O'Kane of the Airport Minute, the Rocketeer Minute, the 007 Minute, and the Apollo 13 Minute. And I'd like to thank Walt and Alan for having me on their show in this, the second season of The Wilder Ride. Gene Wilder has always been one of my favorite comic talents, and his role in Blazing Saddles confirms the immortal nature of his comedy skills, not just as a performer, but also as a writer. Mel Brooks is a gifted writer, but more importantly, in building these feature films, Brooks relied on a small coterie of fellow comedians like Wilder to make the gags funnier and more incisive, and I think it shows through a lot in this film, in Blazing Saddles. Blazing Saddles was a breakthrough comedy film that applied slapstick to highlight the ridiculousness of bigotry, an aspect that's touched on throughout this season's episodes. In the 21st century, we often live in a more puritanical world, and it's often forgotten that mocking racism, sexism, and so many other isms removes their power to hurt us. I hope this central thesis, repeated in many of these podcast episodes, helps younger viewers understand both the message and the intent that Brooks brought to the screen. Just as Springtime for Hitler made the producers a send-up of both Nazism and audiences' incredible tendencies to reward mediocrity with riches, so Blazing Saddles poked holes in stereotypes about racism, homophobia, Hollywood virtues, and cliches of Western films. It's been too long since I last watched Blazing Saddles, and Alan and Walt's invitation for me to be on this show gave me the perfect excuse to rewatch this classic. The rousing John Morris score, the crack of the whip, Frankie Lane's inimitable singing put me right back in the mood I felt when I first saw this film with my dad as an 8th grade kid in upstate New York. The gags remain funny, the deliveries by the many now sainted actors are timeless, and I think the plot remains uproariously entertaining. I know I laughed nonstop when I watched this film, and I've seen this, for more than 40 years now. While some Movies by Minutes films can be ponderous to dissemble by the minute, Blazing Saddles has new topics in every scene. In podcasting, just like in every other medium, content is king. And I think Walt and Alan have chosen a treasure trove of content in this particular film, which they pursued with great depth and wit during their show. I'm very grateful that Alan and Walt brought me in on one of the earlier minutes to talk about the Transcontinental Railroad, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, and I can talk about trains until we run out of disk space on a recording. So this was a good choice in putting me in at that time. As I said before, there's so many topics to cover in this film. It was a really easy lift to discuss things on this show. If you just think about it, maybe 6 to a dozen topics that you can usually pull out of other Movies by Minute films. This has, I would easily say, in the hundreds of different possible topics, and more than enough for any individual episode. I really hope that listeners to this show have picked up on the affection that Alan and Walt have had for this film. Watching a movie again and again, like we do all the time, a minute at a time, can be really arduous. But you can tell in the host voices how the love of this movie shines through in their discussions, even after the second hour of this film. I mean, when you're watching a movie up until minute 70, it gets really rough. If you'd like to catch up with some of my past work, continue on. If you haven't listened to the first season of Wilder Ride, go back and listen to that. But if you'd like to listen to some of my past work, you can check out Airport Minute at airportminute.com, where I talk about the 1970 disaster movie, not Airplane, but Airport, with my co-host Mark Cerulli. Or the Rocketeer Minute podcast at rocketeerminute.com, where Hal Bryan and I discuss the 1991 Disney adventure movie with the Rocketeer himself, Billy Campbell, being our semi-permanent co-host. You can also listen to me and Chris Henry, who is the director of the EAA Aviation Museum in Oshkosh, as we talk about Ron Howard's 1995 movie, Apollo 13, with actors, special effects crews, and real Apollo astronauts at apollo13minute.com. Airport Minute, Rocketeer Minute, and Apollo 13 Minute are also available on Apple Podcasts and Google Play. As we're finishing up here, I'd like to say all the best to Alan, Walt, and all of you many Wilder Ride listeners. Thanks for making this a great ride, and hope to see you here next season. Thanks.
All right, so Jim O'Kane weighing in, and I think great way to start it off with going look at our list of guests, because he did have an affinity for talking about trains. He talked about transportation, but in general, I loved hearing somebody said, it forced me to go back and watch a movie I remember loving and seeing with my dad when I was a kid. And now I got a chance to laugh at it again and laughed all the way through it. And that to me, that's awesome. Yeah,
that says an awful lot. It says an awful lot about the movie. I mean, how many times do we see something now that we're like, that didn't really hold up? But for him to go back all this time later, and for somebody as intelligent as Jim is too, he's not he's not one of those people that you underestimate. He is a very smart guy, and for him to really get out of it what he does on the second run, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, he's one of those guys. He'll definitely be back, and I would certainly encourage you folks, if you want a more sort of academic version of what we do, Walt, you and I obviously have no problem going down some silly rabbit trails. We let our 14-year-old brains out way too often.
Us?
Jim has lots of things that are humorous, but lots of things that you're engrossed, because he's getting actual astronauts on his show. He's getting people
that blows my mind,
like the actor who played the Rocketeer, to weigh in on what it was like to be on the set day in and day out. I mean, it's engaging. And so I would highly recommend checking out any of the shows that Jim O'Kane is with, or looking when he's guested on others, because he always brings something very intellectual and very interesting to the conversation. It's not dry. It's not dull. Don't take intellectual the wrong way. He's very, very smart, but it's always with a sort of like the twinkle in your eye when he's talking to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And if you do get a chance, the Apollo 13 Minute is really amazing. The stuff that they get into, the technical stuff, but then also a lot of the trivia that went along that you don't see in the movies. It really is a great podcast and a lot of fun to listen to.
One of the guys that's been with us as we move along with our returning guests that has been with us, we referenced in our last episode, episode 93, yesterday's minute, Professor Robert E.G. Black. And we call him that because he is an actual professor. That's what he does.
That's right. He is a professor of communications out in California. And Robert and I have gotten to be friends. I think you and Robert talk fairly regularly, too.
Yeah.
And I was just on the Room Minute. Robert tends to really push us because he'll go tackle these horrible, crazy, weird, strange movies. And The Room, if you're not familiar with it, is rightly seen as one of the, if not the worst movie ever made. And so Robert plugged me in for a few minutes of it. And I was telling him before we started recording, the minutes he chose for me, he always does stuff like this to us. If you know me, you know prude is probably not really the right word, but I tend to, play some of those things a little bit closer to the vest. And so the first minute of the movie that he had for me was a sex scene between the two main characters. And I told him originally, I was like, nope, I'm just going to, beg out of that minute. But it was so bad. It was like the worst, uncomfortable, horribly done, awkward minute. I was like, okay, I'm in. So I did that, and then 2 other minutes of that film. And that film is so hard to watch. But Robert is a great guy, and I like the things that he has to say here. Some fair criticism and some things that he and I over a beer one day will talk a little bit more about. But I think that, we are looking at an older movie. We're looking at a movie from the 1970s and a movie that we kind of grew up on. And I think for me, because of the humor, and Jim O'Kane even said that humor removes the power to hurt us.
Right.
And I think that's an important thing to remember with this, and I'm not really taking issue with Robert, but just kind of as a caveat to what Robert's saying, that some people aren't going to drop their guard with a speech, and some people aren't going to drop their guard with you going, hey, you need to quit being this way. But the message comes across more clearly to me and to other people, no matter what that message is, through humor. So I think this is a good vehicle to get a good message across. And I do understand what Robert's saying, and I think that there's a lot of validity to some of the complaints he brings up.
Yeah, I think I'll give some additional thought on the backside of what he has to say, but my comment is always this. We have to remember the context. It may feel like, oh, there's other movies that call into whatever better. There's better movies that deal with racism. There's better movies or heavier or deeper movies that deal with sexism or race or whatever your ism is. Mm-hmm. We have to remember, prior to Blazing Saddles, there wasn't a whole lot being done out of the Hollywood era, the Hollywood stages, to try to call into attention the whole civil rights movement and to get past it.
Right.
And they realized, in fact, Andrew Bergman said it himself, he couldn't write a script set in 1974. It was too close to the audience of that day. But if I could trick that audience by setting it 100 years back and making it a really silly, funny movie on the surface, then maybe we can trick that audience into like letting the message get to them after they've left the theater and they're talking about it, much like you and I have talked about this movie all season long.
Right. And there is a truth in communication that if you address someone directly, they're much more likely to get defensive than if you address in a vague way. In other words, if you say, man, I knew this guy who was a stone alcoholic and he did all these things and his life was a mess. The alcoholic that you're addressing is going to be much more likely to listen to what you're saying and get his guard down than if you walk up and go, hey, Bob, you're an alcoholic and you need to start changing because here are all the things you're screwing up.
Well, it's the old phrase, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. If I come up to you and say, let me tell you why you're a worthless piece of crap, chances are you'll have shut down before I get that first sentence out.
That's right.
I may have absolutely perfect, legitimate things that you need to be fixing in your life, but if I come across that way, you won't listen to a single one.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, our professor is a fantastic guy. He is great in conversation. He is very intellectual, as you'll hear here in just a moment. He's also got a pretty good sense of humor about him, and he's actually produced a bit here where he decided, he goes, I'm going to add some sound effects. Is that okay? So kick back, relax, and let's revisit back with Robert E.G. Black, who was in minutes 7, 8, 9, 26, and 27.
Hello, the professor here, Robert E.G. Black. If you don't listen to any of my shows, you'd know me from minutes 7, 8, 9, 26, and 27 of the Wilder Ride's coverage of Blazing Saddles. And you hear my name in the Friday episode Patreon list because the Wilder Ride is one of my favorite Movies by Minutes podcasts. And I've got a few things to say about the Wilder Ride and Blazing Saddles. So hold on to your boots.
Trigger warning. Trigger warning.
The following segment may include negative statements about the film Blazing Saddles. The podcaster speaking here may mention that Alan, the Colonel was my dad Sanders, and Walt, Redneck, and an Insult Murray are white. Also, Professor Black is not the biggest fan of Mel Brooks, but this isn't the Mel Brooks Ride, is it? The only Mel Brooks movie I was familiar with growing up was Young Frankenstein. We had it on video and watched it a handful of times every year. I don't know if I ever saw Blazing Saddles start to finish until 23rd June 2015 when I watched 42 Westerns in 32 days and took a road trip to Tombstone, Arizona and Fort Sumner, New Mexico to see some of the real places that figured in these stories and these films. I wrote little about Blazing Saddles that day because that road trip killed my car and we had gotten home a day later than expected and I was exhausted. At the time, I liked it, thought it was funny. Blazing Saddles relies on some racist and sexist humor, but plays it all for laughs. You don't get the impression that any of it is mean-spirited. I especially appreciated the ending because watching a month full of Westerns, I saw the ending as the Western as a genre spilling into all other film genres and spilling into America because the Western is inherently American myth-making, rewriting our own history. They've mentioned on this show several times how it's unrealistic in all these Westerns that all the cowboys are white. But that's deliberate. We were creating a story about our history. Blazing Saddles is one of the Westerns that breaks with that tradition. I watched the film a couple times this past year knowing the Wilder Ride was doing it and anticipating being a guest. Now when I say Blazing Saddles couldn't be made today, it's more that it shouldn't be made today. Number one, the obvious reason that Walt and Allen and various guests have said, it doesn't need to be. Reason number 2 is that it really doesn't express the whole punching racism in the face message as strongly as Alan likes to suggest. Act 1, everybody's racist in this movie. The non-white characters, expendable and working for the railroad cheap, maybe have justification to think none too kindly of their white overseers, but the movie does not paint an explicit picture of racist equals bad. The bad guys are racist, sure. Lyle, Taggart, Hetty.
Not Hetty, it's Headley Lamar.
But so are the people of Rockridge. The slight transformation of the Up Yours woman.
Good morning, ma'am. And isn't it a lovely morning? Up yours, now.
From impulsively racist to only racist in public.
Good evening, Sheriff. Good evening. Sorry about the up yours now. I hope this apple pie will in some small way say thank you for your ingenuity and courage in defeating that horrible Mongol.
Thank you. Much obliged. Good night.
Of course, you'll have the good taste not to mention that I spoke to you.
Of course. Good night.
Is amusing. But just because you make the magical Negro your main character and give him a white sidekick and he saves the townspeople doesn't mean that any of those townspeople have changed at all. They agree to take in the railroad workers in exchange for their help, but how much will all those Johnsons regret that decision when the dust is cleared? Especially when Bart rides off to fight injustice elsewhere. Especially when the reality of the situation is having that many new people in their town, and most, if not all of them black, is exactly the thing that led to white flight in cities across the country. Especially when those new arrivals are now unemployed and there are not enough buildings in Rockridge to house them all unless everyone is doubling up, and sharing a house with a stranger might, in the right sort of comedy, be exactly the way to become best friends, but it is also fuel for becoming the worst of enemies and picking at each other's faults and exacerbating all those racist, sexist, classist urges that were there before. But yeah, it's a comedy, it's a satire, so we're not supposed to demand realism, I guess. But even as a satire, like many a Western actually, Blazing Saddles is a critique of corporate-led Western expansion and the idiocy of bureaucracy, far more than it is a critique of racism. The problem is not that Blazing Saddles uses the word dirty word! He said a dirty word! The problem is that Blazing Saddles has very little to say about the use of that word. It doesn't go so far as to use it to be edgy like some bullshit Tarantino film. But a couple conservative white guys like Walt and Allen too easily latch onto that word and objection to it and make the case repeatedly, though without clear examples of actual complainants. You can color me one now if you like. That people hear that word and shut down and stop listening. Like Mel Brooks himself famously complaining about stupidly politically correct culture and that being the death of comedy.
They hear certain trigger words and they immediately shut down. Walt and I think that that's such a disservice to this movie because you're missing the bigger point.
Well, the explicit suggestion is that you should watch Blazing Saddles without shutting down because it uses the N-word. There's an implicit suggestion in the lack of explicit examples that we should never shut down and stop listening if someone says something offensive. But to that, I say, if someone starts off with something offensive, I have no obligation and will generally have no inclination to keep listening, and that is fine. Person calls you some racial slur or some sexist term, f*** that person. Move on to somebody more pleasant. There are billions of other people you can talk to. The political angle, though, and this is on liberals as well as conservatives, is that we take offense at the things that others say, and there is not necessarily anything wrong with that. You call a black guy a he should be offended. You call your Chinese railroad employee a he should be offended, and we don't need a 40-year-old comedy to tell us that we need to get past racism and get past our differences. You've got multiple films every year making that same argument. Unfortunately, film can often inspire individuals, but can rarely inspire the masses. And it becomes more and more unlikely that a given film might have the positive effect as social media pushes us or lets us push ourselves into little enclaves of like-minded folks. And multiplexes and streaming services make it all too easy to skip the movies we don't want to see, and the internet is such an easy place to dismiss something as racist, as sexist, or alternatively as feminist or virtue signaling, and then move on. The great thing about the Wilder ride is that this show has more to say about racism than Blazing Saddles ever did. I told Walt in an unrecorded conversation recently that I think I like Blazing Saddles less now after having it broken down because its simplistic Bugs Bunny plot does not hold up very well to scrutiny, but it was worth talking about. And these guys are moving on with Gene Wilder, but I hope some other Movies by Minutes folks, or brand new ones listening now, but who've never gotten into podcasting yet, might tackle a more recent film about a topic controversial and important, not because more recent is better, but because there are hundreds of new films every year, and latching onto the zeitgeist of today and really talking about something like racism, like sexism, like homophobia, like government bureaucracy and corporate land grabs even. That would be something. Until then, and after, of course, because this show is awesome, I will continue on the Wilder ride. And in case Alan doesn't have everything for my intro, go to lemmingdrops.com and you can find the links to all my podcasts, past, present, and future, including Michael Myers Minute, Dave Made a Minute, Annihilation Minute, The Room Minute, Mandalorian Time Machine, Greetings from Wonderfalls, and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Minute. And you can find links to some art, some prose, some comics, and my blog, The Groundhog Day Project. Or just hit me up online, Robert E.G. Black on all your social media, if you want to talk movies.
Well, there you have it. Now you understand why he's known as Professor Robert E.G. Black.
That's right. That's right.
I'll tell you, and we set the stage a little bit going into his piece, and we did not edit anything, by the way. I don't want anybody to feel like, oh, you took out. No, we said, if you give us what you're giving us, save for, stutters and things that we will clean up, I mean, we're going to keep it all together. But I do want to address just a couple of things that he mentioned. He says, if somebody says something that you don't like, it's okay to shut down. And I think he missed the point when we had that conversation. We said specifically, there's a difference between just hearing a word out of context and shutting down versus understanding the context. So I think we were probably both arguing the same thing. We both said, if someone's going to come at you and say, with all the mean-spirited vim and vile and just nastiness, I'm not going to give them the time of day. I'm not suggesting you have to take it. But we said, too many people today hear just a word. It doesn't even matter if it's being used to educate, if it's being used to be funny, if it's used, they'll just shut down. And I think that's what we've been trying to say with this movie. Don't let words by themselves make you not want to listen to the movie.
Right. And I think Robert would agree with that. With the conversations I've had with him, I think, and I'm not trying to speak for him, but I think that what he was probably saying is that if someone comes, if someone's having a conversation with you and they're obviously racist and ignorant and whatever, yeah, probably not worth your time. But if it's someone who's interested in talking about the subject matter and having an actual discussion and, that person is worth the time and worth the energy. And I think something I want to address that Robert said that I think is interesting that we really have not gotten into about this movie, the idea of corporate expansionism, and I would throw in government expansionism, is an interesting topic, and it's something that we could spend a long time on. There are two books that I've read. One of them I'm actually about halfway through right now, and that's a book called Dodge City that is looking at Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and the other folks who made Dodge City what it was. And another book that was on the history of Western cinema. And there are two topics that keep coming up. One of them is that the demographics were terrible in the movies versus what the reality was. And we've talked a little bit about that there were just no black people in movies, and about 25% of actual cowboys were actually African American. But corporate expansionism and government expansionism were two real issues that kept coming up. Land was the prime way to get rich, really. The more land you had, the more you could grow, the more you could use that land, around the railroads and other things. So land was very, very valuable. And that is a topic that comes up a little bit. I mean, it is an overarching theme in this movie that we just didn't get into as much, but the land snatch issue, that they were trying to steal the land so they could take over and make tons and tons and tons of money because the railroad was going through there. That's a huge issue. And that comes up in a lot of Westerns. That is something that we probably could have gotten into a little bit more.
Well, I think we focused more or less on what the point of the movie was initially, which was how do you get, again, the context. 45 years later, we can see that there's some other themes in the movie, but the biggest theme that the movie was addressing was black and white culture in America.
That's right.
Period.
That's right.
And I think what Robert brought up, which I absolutely do love and applaud, is the fact that he said he enjoyed hearing the conversation, hearing us talk about what others would probably say, wow, I can't believe you're doing that movie. That's got some difficult things in it. He's like, no, we should see more podcasters figuring a way to create a conversation, find that fine line where you're not offending the audience, but you're also asking the audience to, hey, we're going to be talking about things, and hopefully you're going to want to listen, and maybe it'll expand your view. And I've always been a fan of the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that if somebody were to turn around and do this movie in a similar format or whatever and take a different view, I would probably listen to every minute of that show. Alan and I don't claim to have the final word on anything here. But
I'm married. Yes, I don't have the final word on anything.
No, absolutely not. And so that's one of the great things about this movie, has been able to have a variety of voices and perspectives. So
the other thing I want to mention, though, is also Robert talked about some of the simplicity and that it really doesn't do enough. I would argue the exact opposite. I think you have to realize that your typical, everyday, ordinary, average American citizen is going to have sort of that baseline view of the world. They're not going to have the elite ivory tower of knowledge from all of this in-depth, learned studying. They want to just get a simple story that they can easily digest. Mm-hmm. I think if you overcomplicate it and you try to make it too heavy, yeah, there's going to be an audience member out there that's going to be like, wow, that's really, really good, and that was heavy and in-depth, but you're going to drive away another segment of the audience. And with the popularity of this movie, the fact that it was the #1 grossing movie of 1974, that means you were affecting a very wide audience, and you have to keep the audience in mind. And if your goal was to try to spread the message as far and wide as possible, you couldn't necessarily narrow its focus to just the lovers of heavy drama. So I would say you kind of have to keep in mind, well, what was the goal? And if Mel Brooks, as he said, was my goal was to tell a story that would help bring some race discussions and try to maybe alleviate racial tensions in our country, then I think the easier, the more black and white that message. Yes, it's a very complex issue, but sometimes you need to just hit it initially with that very simple, get the conversation started, then start talking about all the nuance and all the gray area.
Sure. And a politician one time told a story that he had made this speech, and I want to say it was in downtown Detroit, kind of covered all these topics and everything. And this guy comes up to him afterwards and says, look, I drive a bus, and I drive a bus for a living. You talked about all this other stuff. All I want to know is, if I vote for you, am I going to keep getting to drive my bus and feeding my family? And in essence, that's kind of what they're doing here, is they're saying, okay, we want to hit the bus driver and the farmer and the guy, we want to get as many people in the theater listening to this and watching this movie as possible. And it doesn't get into all that, but it does deliver that good message. So
I would certainly encourage you folks to go out there and check out some of the projects that Robert has done. I know I was on the Michael Myers Minute for you folks who are Halloween fans. Walt and I both did random crazy minutes in a movie we had never seen, which was the point of his project. Dave made a minute. You just talked about being on the Room Minute. Of course, there's some other things he's working on. Definitely great guy to follow, great guy to have in your social media, and we'll have a conversation with you. You may not like what he says. If you're looking for agreement, then be careful, because he's going to give you a very intellectual and learned response back, but a great guy to have that conversation with. And we appreciate Robert being a Patreon subscriber and a lover of our show and a frequent contributor in our listeners group.
And just one of the nicest people you'll ever meet.
Fantastic guy. I told him, that's so funny you said that, because I was chatting with him and I said, at some point we will be together at the same time where we can grab grab a drink or 12 and talk about all of the stuff that we would love to talk about for just hours and hours and hours on end. We'll talk about a guy who knows how to talk. We go to our next guest. Yeah. We have got BK, Barry King. BK from BK on the Air. That's BK on the Air, the radio show. He was with us for minutes 10, 11, 12, and 13, and then came back. We had a guest that had a scheduling issue and was also in minute number 48. BK, hashtag BK ruins everything. Hashtag BK spoils everything. What more is there to say?
BK is BK.
BK is BK. So let's hear more from BK on the Air.
Hey, it's BK on the Air. I want to thank my pals at the Wilder Ride for having me on a few more times to talk about Blazing Saddles 1 minute at a time. Some of the folks at the Wilder Ride, I won't name any names, have said that I don't follow directions. I get off track and don't answer questions that are asked and spoil things sometimes. Personally, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. So with that being said, I'm going to talk a little about Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Why not? No, I'm sorry. No. Just kidding. I'm sorry. I know it's Blazing Saddles. I know, really, I know. Well, Blazing Saddles sort of paved and cleared the way for future theatrical comedies such as the Zucker Brothers' Airplane, Top Secret, and the Naked Gun movies, and others. Some would say much later Mel Brooks films turned into pale comparisons of those, unfortunately. But his style of these films, including Young Frankenstein 2, remains fresh and unique still. Now, I first laid eyes on Blazing Saddles when I was a kid. My dad had it on in the living room. I was maybe 9 years old, and I wasn't really getting it or paying attention to it until I saw one of the characters walk out of the movie and into a modern-day taxi cab. Now, that was really weird and crazy, I thought to myself. And that, even though I didn't know it at the time, in a nutshell, was the genius of Mel Brooks. Since then, I've seen Blazing Saddles many times, and over the years, at least for me, it just got funnier and funnier. And as far as the late great Gene Wilder goes, he's fantastic and funny as usual, but this is one of his more subtle and subdued comedic performances. Now notice I said one of, not the most. His Waco kid is funny, smart, cool, and he's downright calculating in this film. He almost seems to know what's going to happen before it does, and it's another, don't get me wrong, a stellar performance for Mr. Wilder. The cast member that really shines in Blazing Saddles for me anyway is Harvey Hedy Lamar Corman. He was hilarious in everything that he did on the Carol Burnett Show. He was also awesomely spot on being the straight man. Hearing his son, Chris Corman, talk about his famous father on the podcast, plus on my radio show, was informative and gave us even more insight and allowed us to learn a little more as to just who he was as a person and a father. Some moviegoers, they've criticized Mel Brooks for his bad taste, which is kind of like criticizing grass for sometimes being green. Vulgarity is one of his specialties. I mean, watching Blazing Saddles is like visiting a nice Western art museum and looking at the most beautiful works by Charles Marion Russell and just throwing everything crazy and outrageous at it. But one of the most important things to remember is that it worked. You walk up to anyone today, look them right in the eye, and say, "Candygram from Mongo." And depending on their age, just watch their reaction. If they smile and laugh, you can be friends with them. If they say, "What?" and look at you like you need to be committed, then just walk away. And by the way, if you need to be committed, that's okay too. It's just a Mel Brooks influence. And as far as any racial complaints and problems with the film, just shut up and go home and change your diaper. The adults are talking here, okay? The late film critic Roger Ebert wrote, quote, "Blazing Saddles is a crazed grab bag of a movie that does everything to keep us laughing except hit us over the head with a rubber chicken," unquote. That's a pretty damn good way of putting it. Now, I want to remind you to be sure to tune in to me, the big fat retro geek of talk, radio, and fun, BK on the air, Saturdays, 10 a.m. till noon Eastern on WBHF Radio. You can listen live at WBHFradio.org, or you can use the TuneIn app for all your mobile devices. Hey, thank you, fellas. I appreciate the opportunity to use my tongue prettier than a $20 whore.
Well, leave it to BK to put in his own joke about himself trying to do Willy Wonka. Obviously, he caught his own joke and laughed at it. But BK is one of those guys who loves older movies, older TV shows. He bills his radio show as a look at nostalgic geekiness. He's very funny, has a great sense of humor, and has been one of our great guests to have on the show.
Yeah, he is. And actually, that's how you and I met, was through his show.
It's his fault.
His fault. So y'all can blame him. He referenced Charles Marion Russell in there, and I have no idea who that is. And
Jim Dunham at the Booth Western Art Museum does, because there's some original Charlie Russells over at the Booth Museum here in town.
And what is his...
He is probably thought of as like one of the grandfathers, if not the owner of Western art. Like that's
Gotcha.
Starting the whole idea. That's like saying Ansel Adams is just some photographer.
Gotcha.
Charlie Russell is probably one of the preeminent example of what Western art is, and that started the Western art movement.
Gotcha. Well, I thought Instagram made us all Ansel Adams.
Yes, we're all award-winning photographers with point and click at our meal.
Yeah, pictures of our dogs. So, well, I think that some of the things that BK said were dead on, and I always appreciate BK. For one thing, every conversation I have with him, he can blow through about 18 actors who played in something and all the other actors who've ever played in
without
anything.
Pulling up IMDb.
Right. He is like a walking IMDb.
He is a biological IMDb.
Yeah.
In fact, sometimes I go, do you want to maybe make room for one or two other things other than this? Just in case, I don't know, the conversation headed toward a different direction outside of old movies and TV shows.
Well, where he spends his time nearly solely on movies and stuff, I'll watch football and hockey and baseball and politics and,
he'll be like, why do that when I can watch Young Frankenstein for the 500th time?
Right, exactly. Or some obscure horror movie that we've never heard of. So, but I really appreciate the things that he said, and he is he and I have talked about Blazing Saddles probably 8 or 10 times through the course of this season, and different parts that we were working on at the time, and just he has helped flavor some of my thinking on this movie. So.
One of the things he said that I think you've also echoed, and we've talked about it, it's sort of that universalism. If you say a phrase or a word from one of your favorite movies, and in this case, Blazing Saddles, and someone gives you like the next line or immediately starts laughing and gives you another line, we've said you found basically a brother from another mother.
That's right. I think he was the one who kind of coined the term that you're like pinging your audience to see who out there is one of you.
And it's so true. It's so true. If you start saying a line or you even say it in a way, you try to sort of mimic or copy the style of the delivery, and you get somebody like, oh my God, Blazing Saddles.
Mm-hmm.
You found, at least at the humor level, somebody that you're probably going to get along with on that, that one topic. Also, I love when he said it set the stage for all of the silly movies to come, so many of which we all share a love of. Airplane, Naked Gun, and like Top Secret. And all the Zucker brother comedies, and then there's been so many that followed. Some do it better than others, but I don't think you get Airplane if you don't get Blazing Saddles first.
Oh, I would have to agree with you. I think just from a corporate movie standpoint, they probably would not have bet on that, but also from the audience standpoint, that this primed the pump for a lot of other stuff with the audiences where we would say, hey, here comes something that looks like this. I'm in.
Yeah. Well, BK, like I said, can be heard on several minutes. He was on minutes 10, 11, 12, and 13, and then minute 48. So check out those minutes if you want to hear more of BK. Well, another person we had was a young guy who's, I think, more of a participant in a lot of discussions, doesn't have his own movies by minutes format, but I think he's gotten involved with so many discussions, he's probably felt like he can jump in now. We're going to hear from him in just a minute. That's Paul Tianxi Li, who is a Chinese American. We brought him in to chat about the scenes. And I'll tell you, if you have him involved in your group on Facebook, whatever you're discussing, that guy knows so much and spends time writing, sometimes volumes of information that you may have triggered thoughts in him that he went back and wrote up a whole, like almost like a mini paper and then gave it to you.
Yeah. And it's funny because I'll, every once in a while glance down at Facebook and it's like, Paul Lee has commented in the Rocky group. Paul Lee has commented in this group. Paul Lee has, and all of them are real cogent, good, interesting comments.
So let's listen to our guest who joined us for one episode only, minute number 25. Here's Paul Lee.
Thank you, Alan and Walt, for inviting me back to contribute to this final wrap-up for Season 2 of The Wilder Ride. I have 2 closing thoughts. 1. I don't think Blazing Saddles can be made today. Not as is, and probably not as a pure comedy, nor as a comedy western. This doesn't mean that social satire about racism and bigotry can't be made today. Jordan Peele and Boots Riley have already made some great movies that focus on the life of African Americans in America today, and they both inject comedic elements into their work. However, Get Out and Us from Jordan Peele are horror movies first, and Sorry to Bother You from Boots Riley is verging on science fiction, or at least magical realism. But they are all close spiritual descendants of Blazing Saddles, placing their African American protagonists in the middle of mostly white worlds. 2. I wonder about those whom Blazing Saddles offends. I don't think it's a racist movie. That is to say, the movie's point of view is not itself racist. It does depict well-documented racism in the American West, though occasionally exaggerated for comic effect. As far as I can recall, all the African American guests of the show have been very happy with Mel Brooks' depiction of African American characters in the movie. From Sheriff Bart to the railroad workers, just as I am with the depiction of the Chinese railroad workers. More importantly, we all recognize that it is the white cowboys, overseers, and townsfolk who are depicted as being racists, which was often true of the times, as well as being idiots, which made us laugh even harder. If it's about the use of the N-word, then I would need to be convinced that Brooks and his writers and cast ever romanticized its use, or wanted the audience to think it's perfectly okay to use it. Well, that's enough for now. You'll find me in the Wilder Rides Facebook group, as well as the listeners group for the Blade Runner Minute, the Marvel Movie Minute, the Lord of the Rings Minute, and many other Movies by Minute groups. As for what I'm doing now, you might want to keep an eye on the Minute Makers and Listeners Movies by Minute Master Group, where I hope to make an announcement later in 2019. That's all. See you at the next movie.
And there you go. Paul Lee checking in. And I like the fact that maybe we're not the only ones who mentioned he should consider doing his own show with as much prep and as much knowledge as he has. But maybe other people have sort of given him that nudge. So in our comments, let's remind him one more time. We'll subscribe to whatever show he puts out.
No question. I'm sure somebody has come along and said, hey, Paul, we need to work together on something.
You know what I think it is? It could be this. It could be that whole reverse psychology. Like, oh, you want to weigh in on all the stuff that we forgot to put in our minute? Why don't you try it?
Fine.
Why don't you give it a try?
Here you go.
But we can't do it that way because he would say no. So we go, oh my God, Paul, you're so smart. You're like so smart. Like, like everything. You should do one of these. And in the back of our minds are going, I can't wait to find stuff he left out of his minute.
See, and it'd be fun to have thrown him something like the Groundhog Minute that just repeats over and over and over again or something like that. But that's already been done. So
We'll be whatever he decides to do, and I know I'm saying this a little tongue-in-cheek, I think he is fantastic. He's a great participant in the Movies by Minutes world. He definitely is a frequent contributor to not only our page, but the Blade Runner Minute, Lord of the Rings Minute, Marvel Movie Minute. Check those out. He's on lots of other folks' shows as a contributor. Had only really started becoming a guest on a handful, so we actually caught him early.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe between being on with us and hearing over and over what good content he has, maybe that's what's going to put him over the top, and we'll get another Movies by Minute or maybe some other kind of a format. Who cares? I'll subscribe. He just needs to tell me what it is.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing where he lands.
So he was on minute number 25 with us, if you want to check that out. Minute 25. Well, we had somebody who joined us for minutes 28 and 29, the infamous arrival of Sheriff Bart as the sheriff. They'd written, the folks in Rockridge had written for a new sheriff to the governor, and they sent him, and they were expecting him with a party and music and trumpets and even a giant welcome sign. And so we had Father David Mowry join us, a Catholic priest and the minister, the ordained, I guess, clerical advisor for the Movies by Minutes community.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to lay to rest the second season of the Wilder Ride, getting wilder by the minute. It is, of course, a sad day for all of us. The podcasts we know and love become part of the fabric of our daily lives. And while daily episodes about Blazing Saddles may be and itchy and, well, let's be honest, at times chafing part of that fabric, it is still part of our fabric. And its absence will be felt by all of us, like a hole in our sock. There's never a good time to say goodbye. And yet, we all knew this day was coming. I mean, there are only 95 minutes in this movie. We can all count, right? We should be more emotionally prepared for this. And yet, here we are. So, during this moment of farewell, it seems right to me, as chaplain of our Movies by Minute community, to offer a few words in remembrance of our dearly departed season. Now, Blazing Saddles was a movie I already knew and loved before Alan and Walt decided to start on this podcast wagon trail. I remembered laughing myself silly with my kid brother as Sheriff Bart outsmarted all of those dumb cowboys. We loved Mongo, who, while only a pawn in the game of life, was still a king in our hearts. And I was delighted to be a guest on the podcast during my favorite minutes of the movie, when the sheriff was near. That artfully placed bell toll remains one of the most memorable jokes I've seen in a movie. But our beloved second season was about more than enjoying the good times. After all, life is complicated. It taught us many important and difficult lessons. It taught us about how the structures of oppression in our society weigh against true justice, how we ought to judge a person by the content of his character and not by the color of his skin. And most importantly, it taught us that signs do not roll up on their own, apparently. I am still shocked that I never noticed that one guy making the welcome sign roll up like that. I always thought it was a great visual gag, but now it's, some kind of intentional choice by one of the townsfolk, which, to me, makes it seem less funny and more racist, and that takes away from the comedy in that scene, and now thanks to the podcast, I'll never be able to unsee it whenever I watch this film in the future, so I really have to thank Alan and Walt for ruining Pardon me, I forgot myself. This is not a time for nitpicks, but rather a time to cherish the memories this season has given us. I hope, brothers and sisters, that amidst all the comedy and the slapstick that Blazing Saddles brought us, we can recognize the one enduring lesson it tried to teach us. That racism is really, really, really stupid. And now, dearly beloved, ended are the times for laurels and hearty handshakes. Now we must prepare our wreaths and our final farewells. But let us weep not. This season will live on. No, not in our hearts, but in our podcast feeds. It's a podcast. You can re-listen to the entire season by going to thewilderride.com or iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Blazing Saddles may be riding into the sunset, but that's the thing about the sun. It always comes up the next day. So, happy trails, The Wilder Ride, until we meet again.
Okay.
So, Father Dave.
Father Dave? I guess it is Father Dave, Father Mowry. I always go by last name, but you go by first name.
I'm
right?
Protestant, so we're a little less formal.
We don't recognize Catholics.
Well, whenever I text him offline, it's always just Dave. So he told me I can call him Dave. So, but man, that was pretty awesome. That was amazing.
Wow. I mean, to take the Catholic kind of funeral mass format and then adapt it.
Amazing.
That's brilliant. That is just awesome. It's never a good time to say goodbye.
And I love it's just a podcast. You can listen again.
I want to transcribe that and then get a good impersonator, the guy that played Boris the Hangman, to do that same speech. We all gathered here today to lay to rest.
What I would like to do is get it animated and post it on our Facebook page.
That was fantastic. Father Dave was great to have. A true Catholic priest. He's got a background in sort of and teaches how to create those sermons, those lectures, the art of learning how to proselytize, really, how to preach.
Yeah,
and
which is not easy.
Thought he was awesome.
Yeah, and Dave is such a great guy. I've talked to him a good bit offline, and he really is fantastic. And this was the perfect scene for him, needless to say, or the scene that he was on with the shooting of the Bible and Reverend Johnson giving his impromptu sermon there that was not embraced by the town people. So it was fun, and he really gave some great insight. And I still, when I was watching the movie again the other day, that scene I'd just never noticed that somebody actually pulls on the sign to make it roll up instead of it just rolling up on its own.
I feel bad I pointed that out. But at the same time, I think because you don't catch it unless someone points it out, I still think you're supposed to get the idea the sign reacts even to the presence of the black sheriff.
That's what I've always thought.
I don't take it as the guy that then immediately folds his arms like he did it. I think he was just told as the actor.
Right.
The only way to make this gag work is you're the closest to the edge. We're going to kind of do it slow enough and you just pop it so that way it rolls up. Everyone's going to be looking in the center of the screen. They're not going to be looking off to the side. So,
yeah, I think
Father Dave,
you're right.
My apologies. I'd like to come to the confessional and say, bless me, Father, I have sinned. I should not have relayed to you the movie magic on how that sign rolled up all by its lonesome. I still think it's okay for you to lie to yourself. It's okay. It's a little white lie. Pretend like we never pointed out that it's the tall guy with the brown suit.
See, it's usually BK who ruins things. So.
Usually, but see, he's been involved in our show so much, I feel like it's wearing. It's rubbing off. I walk in, my wife was like, "Are you # BK ruins everything?" I'm like, "No." She goes, well, you reminded me of him for a moment there. It's like, oh, I got to fix that.
Well, maybe Dave has a special prayer that he could,
maybe
get the hex
some sort of
off
an
or whatever.
exorcism.
Yes,
can excise us of the demons,
of the BK
demons
ruins
out.
everything demon.
Well, a couple of guys that followed, and of course, Father Dave, as I should just remind everybody, you can check his minutes out. They're minutes number 28 and 29. The next guys were on minutes 42 and 43, and some would argue maybe the iconic scene of the movie, because Mel Brooks said to Burton Gilliam, I'm going to make you famous today. We're going to do something on screen that really hadn't been done, at least not in contemporary modern American movies. And we are going to absolutely capture farts on screen.
It is funny. This is probably the most memorable scene, and I think most people, or a lot of people, would say this is their favorite scene. I think it probably is the most memorable scene. There are some other scenes that I like better. Mm-hmm. But man, this is funny. And
that's why I call it an iconic scene. It's like
it absolutely is.
It's like Slim Pickens riding the bomb in Dr. Strangelove. That's not the best part of the movie, but it's such an iconic moment. Everyone knows what you're talking about.
That's right.
The fart scene is. I mean, how do you go wrong with baked beans and farts and cowboys burping and belching?
You cannot go wrong with that.
It's almost choreographed and it's almost musical in some really, really weird way that only guys laugh at.
Yes. And I'm looking forward to hearing how Tim and Jeff wrap this up.
Tim and Jeff of the Radio Labyrinth podcast, but Tim is also a full-time Atlanta voice talent on a radio show on WSB, the #1 station in Atlanta. So this is not a small little podunk, country station. This is like primetime #1 Atlanta radio station.
Yeah, Tim's definitely an Atlanta celebrity.
And he is so good as voice. He's a voice mimic. He's very funny. And his Radio Labyrinth podcast, along with Jeff Lieboff, his lifelong best friend, is just such great comments on culture. And lately this season, they've been getting a lot of guest interviews from shows on cable. And they had actually, by the time this is out, one of the actors from Deadwood, when they just had the Deadwood movie. So these guys are really, really funny. We're just happy they were able to take some time out of their busy schedule to join us. So let's hear from Tim Andrews and Jeff Lieboff.
I just wanted to take a quick second to thank the Wilder Ride for having Tim and I on again.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. This time we did Blazing Saddles.
Yep.
Learned a lot about that movie.
We went up and checked out the little studio up there. Saw the little town.
Little radio station.
You went to the Hardee's.
Yeah, that was a big mistake. That was a big mistake. But you know what? I suffer for entertainment. And The Wilder Ride is a great podcast, guys. If you're really into really going in depth, taking a deep dive into a film, and it's about Gene Wilder, isn't it? Well, it's a podcast for you.
Yeah, and they're breaking down the Gene Wilder movies 1 minute at a time, which is pure dedication. It's way more work than I could put into it.
Did you learn anything new about the movie?
I don't know if I learned anything new. I did enjoy hearing their interviews with Burton Gilliam. I hope they do release that whole interview.
I love that too, and I love finding out that he was a Ford pitchman, basically doing the same character. I watched a lot of those commercials on YouTube.
Yep.
What was your favorite memory about the film?
Like I said when we were on there, that's literally the first movie I ever saw in my entire life in the theater.
So is the scene we did together, the baked bean scene, is that your favorite scene in the movie?
Yeah, and I just remember the ruckus laughter and not being able to hear the dialogue of the movie for a good 5 minutes after that scene. But yeah, I remember my parents taking me to that, and I remember them saying that I sat through the entire movie. I didn't misbehave, even though I was only like 5 or 6 years old.
You're taking a look at the cast. You got Gene Wilder, Cleavon Little, Mel Brooks, Harvey Korman, Slim Pickens, Madeline Kahn, Burton Gilliam, all titans in the comedy world in the 70s and 80s, and even in the 60s. Most of them not with us anymore. I guess only Mel Brooks and Burton Gilliam are still around. But all those people, not just in Blazing Saddles, are emblazoned in pop culture history, especially if you grew up watching films and comedy.
And I'm looking forward to hearing what movie they're going to pick next.
Oh yeah, what do you think it'll be? Any guess?
I don't know.
Hear no evil, see no evil?
No,
or see no evil.
I don't think they'll go that far.
I know
I think Silver Streak probably has a good possibility.
Yeah,
I'd really like to see him do Willy Wonka, but I imagine they're probably going to save that one.
I'd like to see them do Stir Crazy.
Yeah, that'd be a good one.
They're going to do what they want to do. So Walt and Alan, great job on this podcast. We love it.
I'm still eating those damn beans.
Yeah. The other day,
huge 10-pound can of beans.
You got the beans, and I got the plate and the coffee mug, and I put them in the sink the other day. And my wife goes, "What are these old timey things in our sink?" I said, have you ever seen Blazing Saddles? No. All right. Anyway, thanks for inviting us up, guys. And we're more than happy to come do the next one.
And congrats
as well.
on your second season of
Absolutely.
The Wilder Ride.
We love you.
Yeah.
Hey, you can find us on the Radio Labyrinth podcast on wherever you find podcasts, at Radio_Labyrinth on Twitter, Radio Labyrinth on Facebook. Thanks, guys.
And there you have it. And you can tell these two guys are used to being able to banter back and forth. But it was, once again, Tim and Jeff, great guys. Subscribe if you're a fan of podcasts, especially if you want to talk about what's happening in current culture, entertainment, music, cable TV shows, things like that. The Radio Labyrinth is great. And they have a listeners group. They've got a regular page on Facebook, radiolabyrinth.com or whatever, Radio Labyrinth. But they also have the Radio Shack, which is the Radio Labyrinth listeners group.
Right. And I think that was actually started by a fan, and they've just kind of adopted it as their own because so many people were joining it. But that is one of my favorite podcasts. I listen just about every week. And
it usually drops every Friday. It's a weekly show.
Yep. And Jeff and Tim, and there are a couple other people that come in.
We've got Autumn Fisher, who joined Radio Labyrinth recently. She's also on the WSB program with Tim. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. I said he's on WSB, but it's called the Von Hessler Doctrine, which they put out a podcast. They basically take their show, export it, and put it out there. So if you missed it or you want to hear it anywhere in the country, you can always listen online. But Autumn Fisher will join us actually at the end of this run of guests, because she did join us for some minutes of the show. But Tim and Jeff were the ones who came out last season with Young Frankenstein. We actually had Jeff for 5 episodes. Tim stayed for 2. And then we got Jeff and Tim for 2 episodes this season. And they're definitely at the top of the list for a re-invite back.
Yeah, and those guys are really just awesome. They've had us on Radio Labyrinth twice. You have been on a couple other times since then, as you've been down at WSB. So they've been very supportive of the show. Just great fans, for us, and have pointed a lot of people our way. So we really do appreciate that. And going along with what they were saying, the baked bean scene, it's just. And as you said earlier, just iconic. Mm-hmm. A lot of times you think of Blazing Saddles, you think of this scene. And it's hard to think back, here we sit in 2019 when we're recording this, that in the early 70s, nobody had ever farted on camera. I mean, that's
not in American cinema, certainly not mainstream.
That's really crazy. And to think that this movie was so groundbreaking in so many ways, and that is the biggest groundbreaking way that a lot of us remember it.
It broke a lot of ground, broke a lot of wind,
broke a lot of
walls.
It broke everything. Records.
A couple of things I want to address for those guys if they're listening as well. We are planning at the end of the week to release the entire Burton Gilliam interview. So I know Jeff was really interested in hearing just the whole interview, start to finish. So we're going to do that. And I know they're interested in what we're going to do next. And they thought maybe Willy Wonka. They thought maybe, I know Tim said Hear No Evil, See No Evil, which is certainly one of I love that pairing of him and Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor. They also mentioned Stir Crazy. They mentioned Silver Streak. So all those are good. You guys are going to have to stick around. I teased yesterday. When we wrap this up, we'll let you know.
Yeah, and we've actually talked about every single one of those.
Every one of those has actually been on the list of things to do.
and one stood out real highly, and we will get to that here in a little while. But one of the things about Jeff that is always funny to me is every time we talk to him or if we text him back and forth, he will start making a case for what movie he wants us to do next.
Right.
So it's always fun to see how he reacts when we announce what we're doing.
Yeah, and he's a pretty active participant as well online with their Radio Shack, the Radio Labyrinth listeners group page, as well as the Radio Shack, the Radio Labyrinth regular page. So follow those guys, subscribe. It is a not safe for work podcast. They don't bleep like we do, but hey, that's what makes it sometimes even more fun.
Yeah, and those guys probably know more about just a wide range of current movies and TV shows than anybody out there. So they will come up with suggestions, and they do kind of a
staff
pick.
That's great.
It is. There's no way you could ever watch all the stuff that they're.
I feel overwhelmed every time I go through their staff picks. Like I feel like I'm falling behind.
I do, because I start going on Amazon Prime or on Netflix.
Gotta subscribe to this.
Wait, what is this? What is this? And get it all on my watch list.
Why is the DVR full? Well, it's all these shows I'm supposed to go watch.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff and Tim.
All right. Well, we said throughout the season we wanted to get as much of an eclectic and wide-ranging list of backgrounds and folks, and we even went across the pond this season.
That's
went
right.
across to the UK, picked up some folks from a podcast called 60 Minutes With, and we actually had Dave Robinson, Ben Ford, and Tina Rogers all in different minutes. Dave was able to give us a quick few minutes, but I wanted to make sure we did a shout out because those are 3 of the 6 or 7 voices on that podcast. They really have one umbrella. They call it 60 Minutes With, but then you have to kind of look at the hashtag. Is it a Decade of Decadence show? Is it a Music Check'em show? Is it an ABC of Gaming show? So they've kind of got subtitles that you have to know. I love them all. Maybe it's because I love their accents and I love them talking, and that's another not safe for work podcast. But man, every time they have a new episode out, it goes straight to the top of my listening list.
Well, and again, they're people who we've become friends with, and so that even makes it more fun when we listen because they're just such awesome people. But again, I mean, just like we were saying with Tim and Jeff, that when they go through their staff picks, well, every time I listen, I'm like, okay, there's a band I need to check out. There's a band I need to check out. All of a sudden, I got a list of like 8 new bands I've got to listen to, and I'm like, I can't do this. I'm not awake 46 hours a day.
So, I need to clone myself, or I need Hermione's time turner and go back and do it all again.
Exactly.
Well, Dave and Ben were with us for minutes 49, 50, and 51, and then the other voice we told you about, which was Tina Rogers. Tina was then with us for minutes 52, 53, and 54. So you can get 6 minutes of some of the voice talent from 60 Minutes With. But Dave Robinson, who really is sort of like the owner of the website, owner of the podcast, and has all these talented people with him, Dave wanted to weigh in. And so let's check out what Dave Robinson has to say about his experience on the Wilder Ride.
Hello, I'm Dave from the 60 Minutes With podcast based in the UK. You may well have heard myself and Ben. We were on episodes 49 to 51 of this season, and we were followed by Tina, who is also a member of our team, who was on episodes 52 to 54. So that was 6 consecutive episodes that we were on the Wilder Ride, and we were very, very happy to be so. All of us here were big fans of the show. Alan and Walt do such an amazing job. We listened from season 1 with Young Frankenstein, and in fact it was Ben that put us onto the guys. He listened to it, binged listened to it actually, and said to all of us here, you've got to listen to the Wilder Ride. And we're so glad that he told us this, because it's a great show, such a great show. So of course, when we were asked to be on season 2 and to talk about Blazing Saddles, personally speaking, one of my all-time favourite films. One of the best memories of it is watching it with my dad. My dad is responsible for me being sort of a cinephile that I am, and we used to watch it so often on video. Of course, the camp scene with the baked beans and the farting was always a regular highlight of our film watching together. And I've said this many times on our shows. It's a saying that my dad used to say was, the day that you stop finding farts funny is the day that you forever lose a piece of your childhood. So yes, feel free that when anybody has a bit of flatulence anywhere, just laugh about it. It's funny. It's such a good film as well. The experience of being on the Wilder Ride and breaking it down more. This is, Blazing Saddles is a film I've watched way into double figures. But to watch it in that slightly different way for that minute and really looking into the background of that minute, what people say, the props, everything was a completely different experience, and learnt a lot about it. I mean, Alan and Walt, they do so much work. I mean, doing a podcast ourselves, we know sort of the background stuff that's involved in putting a podcast out there. We don't even do a tenth of the stuff that Ellen and Walt do, and they really do put out a polished show. And they do have a Patreon, and I would say now to anybody, if you want to throw a couple of bucks their way, please do if you listen to their shows on a regular basis, and you should be if you're listening to this. I'm hoping you do. It's well worth just, throw a few bucks that way. It's a hell of a lot of work. My favourite Gene Wilder movie, oh my god, how can you say that? It changes from day to day. Blazing Saddles one day, Young Frankenstein another. Oh, I don't want to Silver Streak, on and on. I cannot wait for season 3. I'm dying to find out what movie they're going to pick for season 3. No matter what it's going to be, it's going to be a great movie because, come on, it's a Gene Wilder movie. And B, that Alan and Walter do are going to do such a great job with it. And I'm looking forward to diving into the minutiae of whatever film that they pick. It's such a good concept, this Movies by the Minutes. I know there's a lot out there. And it's so good with the podcast community that everybody supports each other. So you're listening to this. You've listened to hopefully all of season 2 of The Wilder Ride. Stay subscribed for season 3 with them. Tell your friends about The Wilder Ride. And if you want, have a look at us. Just go to 60minuteswith.co.uk. Everything is on there. We do news and reviews on the website. All of the podcasts are on there. You can get our podcast via however you subscribe to The Wilder Ride. Just search for 60 Minutes With. That's numerical 60, not alphabetical. We currently have 7 format shows, so if you don't like one, there could be another one that you might like. We do movies, music, video games, we do everything. Just go to the website, click on the drop down box for podcast, see the different format shows we do, give us a listen. You never know, you might like us. And now let's move on to Alan and Walt, or however Alan's going to edit this. I may have just made it more difficult for him, because you might not go to Alan and Walt. Anyway, shut up, Dave. Listen to The Wilder Ride.
Well, we said it before, Walt. We'll say it again with other folks that you're going to hear, and all the guests we've had. If they've got a podcast of their own, definitely go check it out. A lot of work goes into it. If you're in this area of putting shows out, you know what goes into it. And 60 Minutes With is certainly one of, I said it before we went to listen to what Dave said, it always goes to the top of my queue, usually because they're longer shows. They don't come out consistently. They don't have a set schedule. They try to do a couple of those individual things a month. So you usually get 2 or 3 drops a month. Sometimes you can get 6 or 7, depending on what's coming out that month. But when you and I would both do the same thing, a lot of times we're outside doing yard work, lawn work, cutting the grass. It's great to put the headphones on and just laugh and listen to these guys talk. And I shouldn't say guys, listen to all of them, because Tina Rogers is obviously, she's with Dave. The two of them are a couple. And to hear them banter and talk and cut and rip and just, it's so much fun.
It's great. It's great. And 2, you're always going to learn something. I mean, whatever their topic is, they know their topic. They really do a deep dive on it. So they're a lot of fun. I really appreciate them, and I appreciate their friendship too. It's neat to kind of be able to talk about, well, here's what's going on in the U.S. with this. What do y'all think, and what's going on there? And they have a whole different view of the music scene and entertainment, and there's shows that are showing over there that I'm like, man, we really need that here, and vice versa. So. And then one thing we all have in common is a love for Monty Python. But it's neat to talk to them and go, hey, what do you think about this with Monty Python? And they're like, oh, yeah. It kind of explains something.
Well, it's also the amount of American shows that they grew up with.
Yeah.
Which you just think, you're just like, well, wow. So we grew up with watching a lot of the same stuff, too.
Yeah.
I do think this is interesting. This is the third now guest who talked about going to see the movie initially with a parent.
Yeah.
We had Jim O'Kane say it. We had Jeff Leboff talk about being in the theater, seeing it, and Dave Robinson saying it was a nice look back with his dad to be able to see and watch this movie and to laugh at it. And the fact that we then, by using this format, pointed out stuff where he'd seen this movie dozens of times and hadn't seen stuff the way you look at it when you look at it 1 minute at a time.
Yeah. And one of the things they pointed out when they were on was I didn't realize how much racism was an issue in the UK. But apparently they've got an issue there.
But also dealing with the same PC, the over-hyper PC culture at the same time. So just because we think this might be unique to America, it's not. Which means at some point the truth is somewhere in the middle, not at the extremes.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's interesting that this message resonates across those cultures.
Absolutely. I do like his line about his dad telling him, the day that you can no longer laugh at a fart is a day that a piece of your childhood dies. That is a great line.
That is a fantastic line. That was the thing I wrote down as well. The other thing that I appreciate him saying is that if you do have a couple dollars laying around and going to patreon.com/thewilderride and helping us out a little bit, that would be greatly appreciated. We do put a lot of time, effort, and some travel time and equipment investments and those sorts of things. So just a little plug there. Thank you, Dave.
And just like the Radio Labyrinth guys, he's like, I can't wait to hear what you're going to do for season 3. Well, you're going to have to listen to the rest of this.
Give it a few more minutes. We're almost there.
We're closing up. We've got a few more guests to get to. But yeah, I did promise we would let you know what we're going to do for season 3 before the end of this episode.
And honestly, we're not trying to be coy. We're still trying to decide.
No, yeah, we just put up a poll because we don't know. So we're hoping people can make that decision for us.
We're kind of narrowing it down movie by movie as we're listening to these guys.
You know, we were very cognizant about going after as many females as we could get as well. Unfortunately, I shouldn't say it unfortunately. It sounds weird.
You mean as guests, right?
Yes. Did I say it in a different way?
Well, you said we're going after as many females as we can.
Well, that's true. But we also wanted to get guests.
Yes, I've tried to narrow it down to one now. But
well, just oh god, gotta stay on target. We did have several females, but they all were clamoring for parts with Madeline Kahn. Yes. Just about. We had one that got the dance choreography with the Buddy Bazaar at the end. But Tierney Steele was a great guest to join us, one of the many female female guests that we had this season. And she was with us on minutes 57, 58, and 59, which were a lot of right with the spit take of Gene Wilder. Did get a little bit of Gene Wilder when Bart got the letter to, I'd like to see you in my dressing room.
Oh, yes, right.
When we talked about, was it written out phonetically like that? We got to see, obviously, some of her wrap-up of being on stage, the I'm Tired, the dance choreography. But she was fantastic. And I always love getting a different gender's perspective as well as a different age's perspective. And Tierney was great.
She really was. And I'm listening to, I just started listening to the MASH Minute, which she is.
This is the Robert Altman movie.
That's right.
Not the series on TV.
Can you imagine doing the TV show minute by minute? But yes, the movie, which I've always been a fan of, it's kind of got some things. Well, anyway, they are doing a great job with that movie. And they're about 10 or 15 minutes into it at this point. So it's not too late to pick up and be able to keep on track with it. So I definitely encourage you to do that.
Hello, Wilder Ride. This is One Steel Sister coming at you to talk about the finale of Blazing Saddles. Guys, I am so proud of you for completing another season. Movies by Minutes podcasts are no joke. They are a commitment. And you got to talk about such a fun movie. Oh my goodness. Not that you don't always. Thank you so much for having me on to talk about how much I love Madeline Kahn. Basically, that's what those 3 episodes were. For those who don't recognize my Twitter handle, I'm Tierney Steele. I got to talk about busting balloons with Lily Von Stoop, and I even got to meet her in her dressing room. I just had to come on and say, thank you for having me on the Wilder Ride. It was an absolute delight. I remember when you announced this project thinking it was such an interesting idea to follow Gene Wilder through these movies. And I think it was really a brave thing for you guys to do, knowing, hey, some of this is going to get a little dicey. We need to figure out how we're going to approach this. And it was really nice to talk to you. I want to encourage your listeners to keep an open mind, keep the historical context in mind. I know in our episodes, we talked a lot about Mel Brooks's intentions when he puts things in his movie that are a little controversial, how nothing is there by accident. And I was really grateful that you guys pointed that out when we were talking. And the one thing I do think the next time I'm on your show, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, I think the next time I guest, I should spend a little bit more time with Gene Wilder. I loved listening to you guys talk about him, but when I was on, I got to see him do a spit take, and that was about it. Which, don't get me wrong, so worth it for what I did get, but just saying, a little more Gene time, I wouldn't mind. So I will just leave it out there that to everyone who is hearing this, keep listening to the Wilder Ride. They are amazing. They've got more amazing films ahead of them. If you're really finding this format to be your jam, you can check out my past work as well as my current podcasts, MASH Minute and Joe versus the Minute. Whew, 2 at once. I'm a crazy woman. At onesteelsister.com. That's ONESTEELESISTER.com. That's right. I made a website. Pretty proud of myself. That's new since I talked to you. Yay! Guys, I'm going to miss Lily. I'm going to miss singing together. I'm going to miss our choreography. But I think oh man, I just almost said, but it was a wild ride. And that is too cheesy even for me. The only thing left to say is bitter, baby.
And there you have it. And by the way, I don't know, I've got a thing for infectious giggles, and whether it's a hearty laugh from a guy or an infectious giggle from a female, yet another reason to have Tierney on. She was fantastic.
Yeah, and I think we'd be more than happy to oblige her interest in doing some minutes with Gene next season. I think the movie that we're headed towards is going to have a lot more Gene in it from end to end. So we'll definitely have that. But I'd forgotten about that spit take minute, and that is a great minute. So... and she really came and brought some great insight.
I love the fact that, she made the comment about we learned a whole lot. We reminded that there's a context to what we're seeing. Mm-hmm. There's a message to this. You got to stay open. And I love the fact that she, much like some of our other guests have said, applauded that we didn't shy away from what could be considered a difficult subject matter or difficult wording or phrases or content, that we actually dove straight in and said, well, we're going to talk about it.
Yeah, and they've got some of that to deal with in their movie. So it'll be interesting to see how they deal with that.
Apparently has gone all in on the podcasting, especially in the Movies by Minutes. She had 2 before she came on with us that have already completed. She had done the Never Ending Minute and the Return to Oz Minute. But then she's releasing the MASH Minute, as you said before we went into hearing what she had to say, and that's the Robert Altman movie MASH Minute. And she is also working on, and hasn't started releasing, at least not as of this moment, but working on Joe versus the Volcano, which is Joe versus the Minute is what it's going to be called. And I know from seeing her talk online, she's already got, I think, 2 more movies lined up that she's either going to guest on, like be a co-host, or will actually run.
I'm glad she's doing Joe versus the Volcano. Not one of my favorite Tom Hanks movies, but it's good to see Tom Hanks getting some love from the group.
No, I love Joe versus the Volcano.
I need to go rewatch it. I saw it once in the movie theater and haven't seen it since.
Now that we've just finished a satire, that's sort of a version of a satire with that story. It's almost like there's a different story being told underneath.
Okay, I guess I'll need to go take a look at that again.
And I think a lot of people didn't know that with the movie when they went to the movies the first time. They were expecting sort of like a rom-com adventure movie.
I think that's what I was expecting.
And it's more than that. That's sort of the device to tell you the story.
So if I remember right, Tom Cruise and...
Tom Cruise.
I mean, Tom Hanks and...
Meg Ryan.
There was another person in it too.
But that's one of the first of what would be, I guess, 4 pairings of the 2 of them.
Yeah, well, that's right. That's right. So, yeah, I definitely need to go back and rewatch that one. So.
Very good. Well, I'm looking forward to her analysis on it as well, and hopefully getting a chance to be on it.
Oh, good. Well, I'll definitely have to rewatch it and then listen, but I'll be tied up listening to the MASH Minute for a while.
And she's going to be a great guest to have. If you're a person looking for a guest, reach out to One Steel Sister on Twitter. She is fantastic.
Yeah, she's awesome.
Well, we have our favorite podcasts and we have our favorites. And that's the cool thing about the Movies by Minutes community, because there's a flavor for whatever is your particular interest. One of the podcasts that I started listening to immediately within this Movies by Minutes format has been the Indiana Jones Minute.
Those guys are great.
Talking about being able to befriend people online and then become, podcasting friends and colleagues. Pete, Jerry, and Tom have become very good friends. All 3 of them were able to make our first season. And Jerry, only because the passing of Dick Dale took place just before they were scheduled to record.
That's right.
Jerry couldn't join us, but we had Tom and Pete together. And Pete was able to send us a few thoughts about being on the Wilder ride. So let's listen to Pete Mummert.
Hey, Walt and Alan. This is Pete Mummert from the Indiana Jones Minute. And I just wanted to say congratulations on wrapping up such a great season of the Wilder ride. I'm not sure if I'm more of a mug or a pug, but either way, this nitwit had a fantastic time joining you guys for this journey. It took me a while, but I was finally able to track down a signed first edition of the Urban Dictionary for you as a token of my appreciation. But Doug Greenberg from the Rocky Minutes stole it when I wasn't looking. If you hear some childish giggling in the background, I think that's probably him. Anyway, my 2 biggest takeaways from the minutes Tom Taylor and I recorded were, 1, Chef Gourmand is really quite tall, and 2, while sometimes it seems like it'd be fun to go back to a simpler way of life, or kind of the good old days when rustlers were rustlers and cutthroats were podcasting mimes, it dawns on me that maybe the good old days are what would make them right now. And actually, I like having more than one flavor. Anyway, great show as always, gentlemen. Looking forward to what's coming next. Thanks.
I got to tell you, Pete, sometimes brevity is the soul of wit. And Pete can sometimes say in just a few words, or if you listen to the Indiana Jones Minute, sometimes you get that sort of grunt, sigh, like, uh-oh, Pete does not approve. Pete has an alternative view of what someone just said.
Yes.
And I have said this to those guys, listening over and over and being a fan of their Patreon content as well. I more often than not align exactly with how Pete sees things. The only difference, he, for some reason, has yet to bring himself to appreciate the absolute brilliance that is Lord of the Rings.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's a flaw. Everybody's got their flaw. That's his.
Not like it, or he's never seen it?
I think he said he tried to watch it and just couldn't get through it or something. And
Okay.
I'm like, wait a minute. One of the greatest movies ever made. So much depth and heart and texture and everything that goes in that movie. And yay! And he's like, well, okay, I probably need to watch it again. And then he said, maybe I need to watch it with you in the room. So I'm like, that's an expensive trip to San Francisco to figure out how to teach you how to watch Lord of the Rings.
Well, he could fly here.
But hey, the Indiana Jones Minute, it's one of the few Movies by Minutes podcasts that I just go randomly back and will just pull an episode to listen to just because they're all that good. The guests are great. Those guys interact so well together. It's very funny, and you can tell they love what they do.
And they really have a depth of knowledge of their topic, and they do their homework. So.
Yeah, and I learned a lot. I thought I knew a lot about the Raiders, Raiders and the Temple of Doom, and then they did The Last Crusade, and they're gearing up for Crystal Skull. And I can honestly tell you, I'm looking forward to whatever minutes we get to be on there, but we are going to be on Crystal Skull. God, that's going to be fun.
It's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting to see where we come out on that one, too, because
it's such a bad movie.
It is such a bad movie. I mean, it is really terrible. Particularly when you stand it up against the other three, it's hard to get through.
You're like, what are we watching? It looks like we should be familiar with this content and the music, and well, I don't know what I'm watching.
Right, and
I will say, all joking aside, I think it's how they felt about 1941 because they didn't really care for it.
Right.
But then when you go look at individual moments and scenes, like some of the action sequences are fantastically directed. It's the story that falls apart.
Right.
And that's where Crystal Skull really suffers.
It does. It does. And one advantage that 1941 has, talking about the Spielberg, John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd movie about the weeks after Pearl Harbor, that movie was just a comedy. I mean, it was a straightforward comedy. So even if the storyline breaks down, it's still a funny movie. And it still has a lot of funny scenes. With Crystal Skull, it just breaks down and it's not a comedy.
Right.
And the adventure suffers, and it's a tougher movie. But I appreciate what Pete had to say. I'm with him. I'm not sure whether he is a mug or a pug. I guess I'm gonna have to decide over some time with him.
But, and the fact that he got us a signed copy of the Urban Dictionary.
Man,
Doug,
that is so Doug
Greenberg. That is so Doug.
So Doug.
So Doug, hide behind his police badge. I can take what I want, do what I want.
That's right.
No, I'm not answerable to anyone.
Typical Doug. So,
well, our IndianaJonesMinute.com is the website, or just do a search Indiana Jones Minute. They're on Facebook, they're on Twitter, they're on Instagram, and they are very responsive, like most of the podcasters we know. Get involved, follow them, like them. They've got a listeners group as well.
I was going to say, their listeners
Crusade.
group is one of the most active listeners groups you'll see.
It's fantastic.
It's kind of like ours that people are posting.
I find myself in theirs more than our own.
Not quite, but yes, I'm in there fairly regularly.
All right, we have one more guest to bring to you, and she was a fantastic add toward the end of the season. Just a few weeks back, we had Autumn Fisher, a fantastic voice talent. She is one of the members of the Von Hessler Doctrine every 9 to 12 every weekday on WSB in Atlanta. Does a lot of funny voices. She's funny. Has a great sense of humor. It doesn't get so bogged down in PC and worrying about, I shouldn't laugh at that or I shouldn't be offended by that. She's almost like 20 years older than she really is. Like she's got the mentality of somebody who doesn't fall for a lot of the traps of trigger words and things. But she's a podcaster on one topic. That's one that she does with another person where they try to only stick to one topic, which they never really effectively do.
I was going to say, there's no way.
And she's on with Tim and Jeff we had earlier of the Radio Labyrinth. So let's find out about the minutes she was on with us, which had to do with Buddy Bazaar and the French Mistake.
Hey, everybody. It's me, Autumn Fisher. Thank you so much for listening to my episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did recording it and talking with everybody about it. I loved the scene that I got to choose. I found out a lot of things about this movie that I didn't know before. One of them being what the French Mistake is. And if you don't know that, I mean, either go back and listen to that episode or Google it if you dare. I love the scene that I chose, which was, the French Mistake. And then, they're doing the dancing and he says, "Watch me." Now I'm afraid to say it because of the reaction I got when I said it. So, you know what I mean? Anyway, I was so grateful that scene was available to break down, and I had such a great time doing it. I think one of my favorite memories of the film is, I think when I saw it the first time, the first viewing when I was a kid, I knew it was funny, and I kind of felt proud that I knew why it was funny. I was born in 1982, and so I think on paper, I'm technically part of this millennial group, but I sure don't feel like one because when I see this movie, I'm not offended by any of the language in it. I completely understand the context of it and deeply appreciate what the message is from the movie instead of not being able to get past just the language that's used. I think that that's really interesting, and people should not be so sensitive with their ears. Instead, be sensitive with your brain and understand what words mean in a context instead of just the word itself. I don't think I feel any differently about the movie than before I was a guest on the podcast. I think that I was able to see a little bit more into some of the making and like the history and the behind the scenes stuff about the movie that I really enjoyed finding out just for, trivia's sake. I loved the breaking down of this movie. I thought it was really, really interesting. I liked finding out a bunch of new things about it. I liked hearing what other people felt about it and sort of reliving moments of it through other people's analysis. I thought that was really great. And I've never been more in love with Cleavon Little than when I think about this movie, probably because he's I've only ever seen him in this movie. But boy, is he handsome and he's got that smile and he's funny and how can you go wrong? Gene Wilder has such a sweetness that shows through. I mean, even in Willy Wonka, when he was supposed to be this like creepy weirdo loner working with little people, whistle blowing, gondola scaring kids conductor, like he still has such a sweet persona that shines through all of that. It's always a pleasure watching him. Slim Pickens, get out of here. Is anybody with me when you hear Slim Pickens? You just remember Robin Hood, the Disney cartoon version of Robin Hood. Madeline Kahn, what a genius. Oh my God. So many brilliant women comedians around that Mel Brooks crew. I feel lucky that, my family exposed me to movies like this and to Young Frankenstein with also featuring Madeline Kahn. So, man, how lucky are we to have this movie, right? I want to thank Alan and Walt and, everybody who loves Gene Wilder and who loves these movies. I was so grateful to be a part of it, and hopefully I can be a part of something in the future. If you want to check out any of the work that I do, I have a podcast with Greg Russ called One Topic. You can find that online in lots of different places. You spell out the word one. I don't know if that makes a difference. I'm everywhere online as Auto Pritz. That's AUTOPRITZ. Pritts. And I'm also on the Von Hessler Doctrine, weekdays 9 to 12 on WSB in Atlanta, and also part of Radio Labyrinth, which is a podcast with Tim Andrews, Jeff Lieboff, and Steph Swain that you should check out. Don't worry, it's Labyrinth is tough to spell, but just remember labyrinth, and you'll figure it out. Also, sometimes your autocorrect, it's such a weird word, nobody automatically corrects it. Anyway, thank you so much, everybody.
There you go. She labyrinth. I never thought of it that way.
I will never forget it.
How to spell labyrinth. I know it's hard. Just labyrinth.
I will never forget how to spell that now. So, but yeah, she's right. If you want to know what the French mistake is, jump over to UrbanDictionary.com.
Or her minutes.
Minutes
84 and 85. Oh, and I was remiss. Pete Mummert's minutes with Tom Taylor. They were minutes 67, 68, and 69.
Okay.
She, Autumn Fisher, was minutes 84 and 85.
Yeah, Autumn was right in the middle of that human avalanche that is the end of this movie.
She was with us when we transitioned from 1874 to 1974 and watched the walls breaking down, and man, we cut across time, space, and distance.
Yes, we sure did. So she had some fun minutes, and I loved having her. I do listen from time to time to the radio show when I'm not in the middle of some insanity in my job, and I listen to Radio Labyrinth all the time. So I appreciate Autumn taking the time to join us. She is a extraordinarily talented person and a fun person to have as a guest.
Yeah, and I would certainly say listen to, if you can, stream it, get the WSB app, or if you want to, they put a podcast out later where they compile everything and put it out as the Von Hessler Doctrine, which is Haessler, Von Hessler Doctrine. She's one of what he calls the doctrinaires, a group of voice talent that he has around him. Eric Von Hessler is the lead on that show, and then they all participate with providing commentary as well as voice talent. They'll do a lot of characters and characterizations. It's a very funny show, dealing with typical what's happening in the world of news and politics, so it does tend to have that as its backbone, but they try to bring a comedic look, almost like the Daily Show of talk radio.
Yeah, and of the doctrinaires, Jared Yamamoto is now the only one who has not been on our show.
True.
So we need to...
Yes, we can rectify that moving into the next season.
Yeah, so maybe he can join us next year, and I don't think there's any chance at all that Eric Von Hessler would be interested in doing a show like this. But
I could do my best to say I need everybody from WSB to be on one of our minutes.
Oh, yeah. There you go. Because it is definitely an interesting group of people.
We're going to take people that are on the #1 radio station in Atlanta, the 7th biggest market in the country, and we're going to bring them down to where they belong.
That's right.
With us.
That's right.
Way down here in the millionth.
Humble them. And yes.
Well, I always wanted to be a millionaire. I didn't know it was being in the millionth place in the way of the ranking of podcasts.
But hey, we're ranked.
We're
That's
ranked.
What matters. We're ranked.
Autumn, that was so cool. And again, she's got her own podcast, One Topic, and it's Auto Pritz on Facebook, Twitter, all those places on social media. She too tends to be very responsive to an audience, and
yes, absolutely.
cool person to have. And I'm looking forward to having her and many of the voices you already heard back in season 3. So Walt, this is our bonus. We wrapped up with an extra minute of finale. We went back and talked to some folks. I know a lot of people are waiting on pins and needles for season 3. What is it going to be? But before we get there, anything else you want to add about what we've just gotten done with today?
Yes, I do. Just kind of a couple closing thoughts real quick. Number one, I did not think that this is where I'd be at the end of the season. But as I think about Blazing Saddles, there are still topics and things that we didn't even get to after nearly 93 hours of talking about this movie. So this is a deep movie. It's deeper than I thought it was on the surface, and I'm glad we tackled it. And it's been a lot of fun. I appreciate everything that all of our guests have brought to the table. I'm just blown away by people taking the time to join us and sit down and talk about the movie and bring their expertise to the table and their opinions and views. So it has really been a lot of fun. I appreciate our listeners so much. I appreciate the people who reach out and ask questions and make suggestions to us, and just the time that y'all spend listening. It blows me away all the time that so many people are sitting down and listening to our show and then taking the time to comment and things like that. And I just cannot tell you how much Alan and I appreciate y'all taking the time to sit down and listen every day. To sit down and listen and binge while you're doing other things. And then all the people who take the time to tell their friends and say, hey, you've got to listen to these two dimwits talk about this movie. It really does mean an awful lot to us. And then to our Patreon subscribers and givers, thank you so much for being a part of this and for helping us out financially and taking the time to do that. That is much appreciated.
Ditto.
Yes, ditto. Ditto. Somebody asked me the other day about the two movies that we've done so far. The question was, which one do you now find yourself liking the best? My ranking hasn't really changed, but it's probably the same for different reasons. But I still love Young Frankenstein. I think it's still in my top 2 or 3 of my all-time comedies and probably the top 5 of my all-time favorite movies. But I think that from different reasons, the view, like the kind of the humanistic view of the movie and how humans just continue to fail in our quest for immortality, it's such a deep, great movie. And Gene's acting is fantastic. But Blazing Saddles is so close right behind it. So anyway, those are just kind of my closing thoughts. Do you have any thoughts? I know that Blazing Saddles has always been in your top of the top list. Is it still there?
It's still my favorite comedy of all time. It's still my favorite Gene Wilder movie in terms of the construction of the movie because of all the layers and all the depth and everything we can learn about ourselves. All the stuff I tried to bring into the conversation about seeing that, you're being taken off guard with what looks like silly on the surface and there's just so much thought underneath. And the analysis we did, I agree with you. Your first thing, we could probably start season 2 over again from scratch and probably have 93 hours of very little repeated content. I agree. We could probably look at it and say, okay, we examined racism. Let's go look at the movie now for how government runs our lives and what they do and the sock puppets that are certain members of government. Or we could go back like we talked with our previous guest, Robert, about government expansion, about just land grabs, things about what it is to subjugate people and try to be in control. There's so much we could still talk about this movie, which to me is why it is easily my favorite comedy. It's not my favorite Gene Wilder performance. I've said that multiple times. I still think as far as just character, Willy Wonka will be the best acting job he ever did. I'm looking forward to finding myself if I'm wrong on that as we move forward over the next several seasons. But for now, I love Young Frankenstein. I gained a huge appreciation for it because I hadn't watched it nearly as much as other movies of Gene Wilder. Sure. And the fact that we opened with that, and I really said to myself, wow, I love this movie now than when I started. I love Blazing Saddles even more than when I started. So I can't imagine... I'm waiting for like the shoe to drop. We're going to come across the movie. We're like, I really used to like that movie. I can't imagine.
That's not going to happen in the next 3 or 4 seasons.
Probably
I don't
not.
think, because we've got some good ones coming. So.
All right. Well, we've got a big display today. We're going to have fireworks. Depending when you're listening to this. That's right. The entire country is celebrating the fact that we have finished season 2. Oh, and also something about America's birthday, Independence Day, whatever.
About that.
But that's been. It's almost like you've forgotten. It's been so long. This is only our 2nd season, so we wanted to make sure we went out with a bang.
That's right.
And as part of our celebration, moving forward with American independence, 4th of July celebrations going on all across the fruited plain. Maybe it can go along with the celebration of not just for what we've accomplished, but the joy of what we're going to do for season 3.
Yes, and this one was one we did wrestle around a little bit. There was one actor in particular that we wanted to start including in our discussions, and so that played into this a little bit. I think I'm not giving too much away yet by saying that Richard Pryor has been a favorite actor of mine.
Oh, we've limited it to 4.
Yep, now we're down to 4 movies. His comedy, his stand-up is fantastic, even though I don't want my kids listening to it yet. But Richard Pryor has always been a favorite of mine, and the fact that he was a writer in Blazing Saddles is also a good tie-in.
It made it a nice leap to go, let's include him now as an actor in the next movie.
Absolutely, absolutely. There was also an actor we were hoping to be able to interview that we're not going to be able to, and we'll explain that in just a minute, who was part of this movie. But the movie that we're looking to do is a good one. Yes. And it's a good one for a lot of reasons. And
in fact, let's do this. Let's drop the trailer right now.
George Caldwell is taking the Silver Streak to Chicago. First class? Yes, sir. Right this way.
He's a busy publisher who's taking the train for one reason only.
I just want to be bored.
Come on. Well, you're in for the ride of your life. You just pick out a little chickie, my friend, and it's hug and munch all the way to Chicago.
What do you publish?
Oh, mostly nonfiction. Cookbooks, how-to-do-it books.
It's very interesting. Are you married?
Divorced.
But in the next 3 days, he will fall in love. He will witness a murder and become involved in a bizarre international intrigue.
All right, listen, Buster, you're in trouble. And I mean big trouble, because I'm reporting you. All right, enough's enough. If you're willing to forget it, I don't believe this. Are you kidding?
From an innocent passenger, George Caldwell will become a victim, a man who will be forced to risk his life in order to save it.
Hold it! Don't move or I'll shoot!
He will fall into possession of the priceless Rembrandt papers and into a perfect frame-up for murder.
Holy moly, you shot him!
All right, mister. Just keep your hands where they are and we'll have no trouble. Give me that.
Don't shoot.
He will make a friend.
Who are you? I'm a thief, man. What do they want you for anyway, man? Murder. Drop me off anywhere along in here, okay? I don't mess with the big earth.
And become a fugitive from the law, wanted in every state.
Wait right here. Go get the tickets and it's goodbye, George. What are you talking about? Well, how are we going to get on the train? Got an idea. I can't pass for black. You tell him. I didn't say I was going to make you black. I said I was going to get you on the train.
It's comedy.
That's my man. That's my man. I don't think we'll make it past the cops. We'll make it past the cops. I just hope we don't see no Muslims.
It's romance.
You've got shoe polish behind your ear.
And adventure in the runaway suspense hit of the year. 20th Century Fox presents a Frank Yablans presentation, Silver Streak. Starring Gene Wilder, Jill Clayburgh, Richard Pryor, and Patrick McGowan as Devereaux.
Where are we going so fast?
You've got a dead engineer in a runaway train that's going to hit Chicago in 15 minutes.
By plane, by train, by the edge of your seat. It's the most hilarious suspense ride of your life. Nothing can stop Silver Streak.
There you have it,
There
folks.
you go. Silver Streak it is.
The first pairing of Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder. They'll end up doing 3 more movies together. One, technically, while Richard Pryor was still in his drug-addled days.
Yes.
Some of the problems we'll talk. I mean, when we eventually get to Stir Crazy, I don't know how Sidney Poitier didn't actually have like a stroke, a heart attack, or just a nervous breakdown trying to deal with Richard Pryor in that second movie. You would have never known it based on what you see on the screen.
You wouldn't.
I still love See No Evil, Hear No Evil. And then another You. Well, we may not get to that.
We may not get to that one. that may not make the list.
So yeah, Silver Streak is coming up early next year.
Did you see Silver Streak in the theater?
No. I saw it on television.
I did. I saw it when it was released. Some of the stuff I didn't get.
We're already starting season 3 now?
Yeah,
is that what we're doing?
We're starting it right now. But it's always been a favorite of mine. So I'm excited to be able to do
I'm looking forward to rediscovering it because it's been a long time since I've seen it. I've got a lot of images in my head. I've got a lot of scenes in my head. I don't have the entire story in my head anymore. I can't tell you start to finish all the things that happened. So I'm really looking forward to where the Young Frankenstein I knew well, but not like I knew Blazing Saddles. Blazing Saddles, we went into it. I could have written out the screenplay, or at least what we saw on the theatrical release and the television. I could have written that out ahead of time. So I was so familiar. This one, it's going to be a lot of research for me because I know very little about the background, the making of. I've only watched it a handful of times. I just know it's a great movie.
Yeah, and it is. And Young Frankenstein was that for me. I could have just gone scene by scene through Young Frankenstein without any problem and given you a lot of information on it beforehand. So this one is, for me, even though I've been a lifelong fan of it, it's not one that I know as intimately as the first two. So we're going to have to do some work. Now, one person that I want to thank for some consideration, and that is Ned Beatty. We reached out to Ned Beatty's agent, and I went back and forth with her via email. Unfortunately, Mr. Beatty is in his 90s, and he is completely retired from entertainment. She did reach out to him and talk to him a little bit about it, told him what we were looking for a little interview, and he said, thank the listeners and thank the Wilder Ride guys, but he has promised his family he is retired. He's not doing any interviews or anything else.
And I get when you make that commitment, you open that door once.
Yep.
And then it opens up. All of a sudden, everybody starts coming at you. Well, how about for us? Well, how about for... And I get that. I totally understand
One of the
that.
things that his agent said was that when he was working, he spent more time on location than he spent at home all those years. So that is a commitment that he made to his family when he retired. So I appreciate that. And, I would have loved to talk to him because I'm a big fan of his from a show called Homicide: Life on the Street. And he played Detective Bolander, and that was an amazing TV show. So unfortunately, we won't get to hear from Mr. Beatty, but there's a whole lot of other stuff coming. We're working on a couple of other interviews with people that I think we may even do one in the off season and release that. I have to see how that goes, but we've got some good stuff coming. There is another actor from the movie who we're in conversations with, a relative who was very close to that person. So we may have some good things coming here shortly.
Definitely. We've got a lot of work ahead of us for the next 4 or 5 months to prep for next season, but we are also going to bring you some Patreon content. So be ready for that. I will tell you that we are planning to do some different things Patreon-wise. We want to try to maybe bring you 4 or 5, maybe even 6 movies, but do it in a different way than we did last year. Maybe breaking them into time. In other words, however long it takes to discuss the movie. If it's a 2-hour discussion, then we break it up into like 4 30-minute chunks. So that way we can release stuff a little bit more consistently while we're in our hiatus between seasons. We definitely want to continue to have that movie discussion. I know we're talking about The Big Lebowski is one. We've talked about maybe an animated movie that Autumn Fisher brought up because Dom DeLuise did one of the voiceovers. We might challenge ourselves with stuff you and I haven't even watched before, but listeners have said, go do it. So we might get our initial reactions on first-time viewings of a few things.
One thing about this is following Mr. Beatty's advice, we also have some time to spend with our families. So
much needed.
We definitely need to do some things that are not as time intensive, and particularly for Alan.
I need to work on as much irritation at home. So she goes, could you please go back to doing your podcast? Because you were gone. Yeah. Oh my God, get out of the house.
I may already be there. So we've got a lot on our plates, but we look forward to getting back in front of the microphone and doing some more movies.
All right, last thing, I know this has gone long. Let me just wrap this up. Thank you, as Walt said, to all of you who have been listeners. We know it's hard to get everything. Sometimes you have to binge. Sometimes you might just catch episodes here or there. But the fact of the matter is we appreciate you, whether you're a listener the minute the episode breaks or you stumble across weeks, months, years later. Just come join us on Facebook. We have a great time. It is a safe place to hang out. It's all about entertainment and Gene Wilder and movies in general. And, as we continue to build the content and build the repertoire, you can be part of this, The Wilder Ride.
Well, I guess that's it.
I'll see you in like 6 months.
So I'll get the horses. Is the limousine waiting?
Thelimousine's just up the hill. We gotta ride the horses though.
Awesome.
All the way up there. I don't mind riding the horse. I would have stayed on the horse, to be honest.
I'd have stayed on the horse.
I'm in a car the whole time.
Well,
I'd rather
of course,
be on a horse.
there's a bar in the limo.
Oh God. Okay, so we'll hop off for a second, make a drink, and then
there we go.
Oh crap.
Naked Gun 2,
No.
Naked Gun 3.
No, hold on. Outtake. It just had its anniversary. It was the World War II spoof.
1941.
No, not 19. Well, technically 1941. No,
Father Dave.
I didn't know if you were going to say anything. I just I just monologued. You didn't come in.
Oh, you had it covered. Two or three all time.
Sorry.
Nice job, Alan.
Sorry.
Dropping the hammer.